something I'm going to come back to throughout this talk is that all of the concepts that I'll be talking about, and I think that will be talked about throughout this, throughout all your sessions today, these are very rarely actually part of anyone's job. And that I think is something that libraries really need to be thinking about if that can change. But until it does, that means they have to be part of everyone's job or they do not happen. Alternately, they become part of the jobs of, say, all the gender inclusion is done by trans people out of self-defense. So what I'm going to do today, I went through a whole bunch of different ideas for this presentation. Full disclosure, this is my first keynote, which is very exciting, and I was very happy to be asked. Thank you, Carl. And it's exciting, but it's also a terrifying lack of specificity as far as the topic. So diversity, equity, inclusion are obviously incredibly important, but it's everything. It's literally incorporated into everything that we do in library work. And if it's not, it should be. So I struggled a little bit coming up with a topic that I felt qualified to address, because part of the reason, part of the issue with a topic that big is that I'm not qualified to talk about things like disability or race or a bunch of different aspects of library work, because those simply aren't in my experience. So I didn't want to do too big generalizations that I was unqualified to discuss. And I also, the other thing about a presentation like this is that I have no idea what kind of experiences you all are coming from. I'm assuming that at a conference like this, we'll have a range of people who have done some trainings, maybe make this part of your work by choice, but also presumably some people who haven't really spent a lot of time for whatever reason doing this work. And I also want to acknowledge that sometimes that is just personal preference, but oftentimes the kind of trainings that let you get started on this work and learn the basics are not offered to people who work part-time or to people who are paid by the hour rather than salaried. So there are a lot of reasons why people might be new to some of these topics. So what I decided to do, let's see, one of my first ideas was this whole big thing about the concept of being an ally and how that centers the non-marginalized person in somewhat problematic ways. And then I decided I was tired of the buzzwords and that would be boring to some people and off-putting to others. It is very much worth looking into. And there are publications by people who are not me that you should read about that if you're interested. But I tried to take a step back and figure out what I actually wanted to get across. And what I kind of settled on was why you're doing this topic, why we say this is such a big part of library work. And so I wanted to really focus on the impact of either specific inclusive practices by individuals or systems, or what happens when those are not in place. So let's see, if we could get the poll, and I will explain that. So what I decided to do is prepare a selection of sort of stories from my personal experience as someone working in libraries, as previously a library student, as a library patron, as a student worker, as a person going to conferences, all different things. And so what I would like you to do is vote on which ones I don't know that I'm going to have time to get to all of these, probably not. So if you would vote on the ones that would be most interesting to you, and we will start from there and see how far we get. While we're voting, let's see, I wanted to talk about some of the things that, like my purpose in choosing this approach. So one of the things that I want to get across is that individual actions make a huge difference. Sometimes I feel like I'm trying to avoid actually saying the acronym because I think that is part of the problem. So sometimes I think diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are completely separate, related but separate huge topics all on their own, it's very intimidating. It's either intimidating in that you don't know where to start learning about it, or the deeper you get into it, the bigger a problem it is. And the more you realize how much work there is to do. So it can feel paralyzing to try and to know where to start and to feel like anything you do has any impact when you can't do things necessarily like change institutional policy or magically get students more scholarships or change your hiring practices. So a lot of these stories will be about things that one person did that had nothing to do with the systems that were set up or the policies that were following, just individual actions that made a huge difference to me or others. The second lesson is that the individual actions are not enough, because often they're actively counteracting or making up for a policy that doesn't exist. We have cat number 2. This is felony. So we need both. We need the individual actions and also the change in all the different systems and policies that we use in library work. And then, like I talked about before, this work is part of, these are a variety of different topics. Some are about particular types of library work. Some are about particular types of experiences where it doesn't matter what job the person had. But this is part of all the different things that people do in libraries. If you don't know where to start with that, if you don't think that this is part of your work, then your first step is to figure out how, because I promise it is. And then let's see, something slightly unrelated that I do want to make sure to point out is that often talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion as library employees feels like an us versus them conversation, not versus, but there's all sorts of issues with, say, white saviorism, and it feels like we, the people who work in academia, will help the lowly, uneducated, whatever, or we, the people of non-marginalized identities, will help the people who need us. And this is something that I think about as well as a transgender person who now passes as a cisgender male. So I try to think about what privilege I have now that a lot of other trans people don't. So with that, my point is just that you don't have to be, well, for one thing, library workers are trans, are Black, are disabled, like all sorts of different identities. It's not that, cattail, it's not that we are helping them, we are all part of this profession as well. And I say that specifically because so much of the literature about gender inclusion in libraries is about how you can help patrons. There's very little acknowledgement that trans people are actually also library employees, both in terms of we are also the ones doing the helping, and there are specific strategies that are needed to make us feel comfortable and safe in the workplace as well. So some of the stories will acknowledge that. A couple things that this presentation is not. It is not a how-to guide. I'm not telling you to follow or not follow any of the specific practices that I'm going to talk about, because I think it's really tempting, and I feel this too, when you're trying to learn about how to do inclusion work, it's really tempting to try and find something simple that you can do. Like, you want to be told what words to use and what things to do, and it isn't that simple. It can't be, because of the diversity of experiences that people have. It varies drastically by your workplace, by the population that you're supporting, by the people who work in your library. So there is not one or even a set of things that I can tell you, do this and it will help all the trans people who work in your library or who come into it. You need to think about why these things worked and what would make sense in your situation. This is also not, as I said, a discussion of theory. I'm going to try to avoid the buzzwords. I'm going to try and make this very practical and talk about why I'm talking about these things in a way that you don't need to have read a bunch of articles to understand. All right, so I think we have enough results to be moving on with. I am not going to look at the chat because that is very distracting and I will lose track of where I am pretty quickly. But if you have questions where you need them answered sort of in a time-sensitive way for this to make sense, then I would ask one of the board or whoever's keeping an eye on the chat to feel free to interrupt me and let me know. And there will also be time for questions at the end. Let's see, I think one of the links that went to the chat, and I will put it there again just in case, is to the Trans Language Primer, which is something that I put there because that will give you, that's a good place to look up any words that you don't know. And I will try not to do that. I will try to make the language pretty broadly accessible, but I've been doing this work for a while and I'm in pretty deep, so I may end up using language that people are unfamiliar with. But that particular resource, you will understand, your library workers. It's written, it passes all of the tests that I have for what makes something a good resource, especially on a topic like this. It's clear about who writes it. It's clear about where the funding comes from. It's written by trans people. So that is something where you can go look up any terms that I use that you don't know. But again, if you're particularly confused about any one thing that's making this not make sense, then please feel free to interrupt and let me know, and I will try to clarify. Any questions before I move on to the story time section? All right, it looks like misgendering in the classroom has won out. That's a good one because it happens all the time. So this is one of my experiences from library school. So to be clear, I drew specifically from my own experiences with the knowledge that a lot of them do happen to a lot of other trans people. That said, they certainly don't happen to all trans people, and how everyone reacts and feels about them is not necessarily represented by how I did. So going back to what this presentation is not, it's not universally applicable. These are examples that sort of demonstrate certain situations, but they're not intended to be universal how-tos or how not-tos in many cases. So let's see, for this story happened in my second year of grad school, at which point I had come out as transgender. I was identifying as male. I had not changed my legal name, and I did not look like I do now because I was still working through the process of starting hormones and starting my physical transition, which, side note, is not a thing that all trans people do and has nothing to do with how trans someone is. But in my case, I have a pretty standard experience of assigned female at birth, now identify pretty simply as male. But this was the point at which I hadn't made those physical transitions. So my voice didn't sound like it does. Didn't look a lot like I do now, no facial hair. So I was getting misgendered a lot, which happens pretty consistently to trans people at that point. And so this was just a pretty standard. I had made sure to be clear about my pronouns at the beginning of the course. The teacher accidentally misgendered me. Something that is going to come up a lot in these stories is that very few of them are about actual malice and actual transphobia, but that doesn't matter sometimes. The impact is still not great. So got misgendered during class. The professor used she pronouns instead of he pronouns. The good part about this, there are two people in this story, and neither of them is a bad person, but one of them was helpful and one of them was not. So I had a friend and a classmate in that session who I felt her get protective, and then she very pointedly didn't overtly correct the teacher, but in her next comment talked about like what I had said, very pointedly saying my correct pronouns. And this is definitely one way. For me, this is, again, not necessarily a thing that works in all situations. There are all sorts of complexities depending on who someone is out to. But for me in that situation, because I was out to everyone in the room and everyone knew, because I had told this group what pronouns I wanted them to use, for me, that was the right thing for her to do. And I eventually emailed the teacher after the class just to remind him of my pronouns. So there are a couple lessons from that story, I think. One of them is that just that one other person making it clear that she had noticed that this had happened, and then taking what actions she could to counter it, that made a huge difference, because in many situations that doesn't happen. You get misgendered, no one acknowledges it, and you feel incredibly alone. So in situations where you're sure that you're not outing the person by correcting, or in situations where you're sure that the pronouns that you know for them are the ones that they want used in that situation, this is something that can make a huge difference. You're demonstrating that their identity is valid and that they aren't alone in feeling like this is a problem, that they've been misgendered. The bigger lesson from this is not specifically about classrooms. It's about the fact that standardizing behavior like pronoun sharing is completely useless unless everyone does the work to then use the pronouns that have been shared. And sometimes that's pretty simple work, like I can tell you all my pronouns are he, him, or they, them. Probably you then will all use he, him, because that is what people assume for people who look like and sound like me right now. But it might take you more work if I had said, I only use they, them pronouns, or other different pronouns that you're not familiar with. So it's not just that it's not just standardizing the behavior of pronoun sharing, which, to be clear, also has to be optional, because otherwise you're forcing people to out themselves. But the other side of that is, once you've shared your pronouns, that's not helpful, and it feels kind of performative as a practice, unless then you can trust that people are doing the work to actually use those. And it is work. We are all part of an incredibly cisnormative society. Cisnormative meaning the society is built with the assumption that everyone is cisgender, which oversimplified definition means not transgender. And so you're all part of that society as much as I am. It takes a lot of unlearning. I'm still working on that. And if people are new to this topic, I want to normalize that unlearning process. I use they, them pronouns for my cats and my Dungeons and Dragons characters, because I personally need the practice of using pronouns that I was not raised knowing that people could use as individual pronouns. So it takes work, and it's incredibly necessary work. I think I'm going to move on to the next story, which we have something of a tie. I think the next one is about managing student workers, which, let's see, going on to my notes on that. Ooh, question that I will answer. When someone's individual pronouns are they, them, or theirs, themselves, you use that just like you would, like, people are familiar with the conjugation for those pronouns. So it doesn't really change when someone's using them as individual pronouns versus group plural pronouns. I think the only difference is that it's best practice to use themselves instead of themselves when you're talking about an individual. Let's see. There's a website called Pronoun Island that I'm going to look up the link to, that does a good job of explaining how different pronouns work, and giving the examples of all the different forms of them. I hope that answers the question. So in academic libraries, what a lot of us do end up managing student workers in various positions, whether it's individuals in our department or in my previous position. I really miss managing student workers, which I don't do at all in my current job. But in my previous position, my first job at a library school, I was head of the Access Services Department at a very small college. I was in charge of managing about 20 student employees. And in undergrad, I was one of those student employees at a different school. So I come to that one from both sides, which I think a lot of us do as well. So I'm going to give a couple specific elements of making student worker management supportive of trans people who come and work in your library. These are not all the things you can do, but there's some particular ones that I felt like I successfully made happen there. So in my experience, we have a lot of queer and trans undergraduate students in many schools. As different gender identities get more normalized in society, more and more younger people feel comfortable coming out at different ages. A lot of student workers they may not have their genders or their pronouns read because they're not in positions where they've been able to change their names, or if they want to medically transition, they maybe aren't able to do that yet. A lot of them may also come out to work and to their friends and their classmates and not to their parents. So there are whole issues with being very careful about not outing students in ways that make them unsafe. I'm not going to get too much into that because it's a complicated issue, but I can talk about that more at the end if people would like. So the specific things I'm going to talk about are ways that I tried to standardize making my access services department supportive to the trans students who were working for me. A big one of these was just the fact of being out at work, and that's not something that you have to do. It may not be something that you can do if you're not trans, but even if you are, it's not something that you have to do. But it's branded into my brain the expression on some students' faces when they come into the library for a tour, and on giving that tour and introducing myself, I share my pronouns. It's an incredibly low bar, but what that does is tell them, I know that trans people exist. It's not telling them that I am one. It's not a particular secret, but it's not something I'm going to lead with when I'm giving a tour of the library. People are sharing some resources in the comments, and yes, please continue doing that. There are many, many good resources. Good job, librarians. So that's a situation in which if you're comfortable sharing your own pronouns in a situation like that, where you're not asking anyone for theirs, it's not like a group meeting, what that does is it tells them that you know that trans people exist, and that if they want to share their pronouns, then they don't have to explain to you what that means. They can feel safe doing that if they need to, and you'll understand. And again, that seems like a really low bar because it is, but it's one that is very often not met. So something that I started doing when I started hiring and training student workers was trying to find solutions to the really common problems of not wanting to misgender people before I'd even met them. And so, let's see, I was also trying to find ways to make sure that the other people who were helping to manage the student workers, who had done a lot less research on this topic than I have, I was trying to find ways to standardize those practices so that it wasn't just that my personal office was a safe place, it was that the whole department was. So a couple things that I ended up doing, let's see, I created an email template for just when I emailed students to invite them to an interview, and in that I asked them a couple different things. I asked them their class year and their major, and what name and pronouns they wanted me to use for them. So this let them share what information they needed to before they'd even come into the library, before they'd even met me. Something I do want to point out about that is that a lot of them didn't answer that question, and that is not a bad thing. I think there were two main reasons. One of them was that a lot of them just didn't understand the question. Many people who have not been exposed to trans issues just don't understand the concept of pronoun sharing or of a name of use. And so that wasn't something I was ever going to punish them for. Like, I would never follow up and demand that they share this information with me. Because the other reason someone might not want to do that is that they are not comfortable sharing that. So plenty of trans people are not comfortable sharing their pronouns, especially in a space that they're not familiar with, because if you force them to, you are either demanding that they lie to you if they can't share what they actually identify as, or you're forcing them to out themselves before they feel comfortable sharing that. So when we talk about standardizing practices like pronoun sharing, what I mean by that is doing things like I talked about before with sharing my pronouns and creating a space where people can if they want to, but never forcing them to, and never point blank asking them. It's a faulty practice, but I haven't found a better one, but my best approach is to default to they, them if I don't know someone's pronouns, and as soon as they correct me, then like if that's not what they go by and if they use something else, then correct to that. Let's see, trying to stay on topic, but again, as previously discussed, this is why I'm focusing on the specific element of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because even this topic is overwhelmingly enormous. So the other thing that I did with the student workers that I standardized was creating a name tag template where I specifically asked them when they started working what name they wanted on it and whether they wanted pronouns, and if so, which ones. And again, some students just didn't understand that question, the pronouns part of it. But for some trans students wanted their pronouns, some didn't. So that's another example of why standardizing it is not necessarily a good thing. But something else that came out of that was that it didn't, if people are familiar with the concept of universal design, which if you're not, you should probably look it up and get at least a basic understanding of it. It's an idea that's used generally in accessibility and disability conversations, but it applies in a lot of different areas. And it's the idea that there are some practices that make a space or a system fit for any number of people, regardless of any one identity. So in this case, doing name of use on pronouns, it was helpful for trans students who used a different name than their legal one, but it was also really helpful for my international students who also often went by a different name than the one that the campus had on record. Also with just students who went by their middle name, or just anyone who uses a different name. So when we talk about these practices, like pronoun sharing can be helpful for, say, a lot of cisgender women who don't present in really conventional feminized ways. Like there are many situations in which these practices help a lot of different people regardless of their gender identity. So the last bit about the student workers was that this is an example of something that I tried to make part of the system by documenting what I was doing, so that regardless of who ends up interviewing the student workers now, if they're using the same templates, these practices stick. But if these practices became systemic, it was only because of that documentation that I did. So I think this is an example of a way in which you can both make a difference through your individual actions and use, depending on your position, you can use what power you have to make small changes in policies and systems. And this is also work that you can and should do regardless of your gender identity. There are students who were definitely more comfortable talking to me because I was out as trans, but the specific practices that I just talked about, I certainly didn't need to be trans to do those. And that's the case for a lot of policy changes and best practices. You don't have to be a trans person to implement them. Let's see. Any questions at that point while I hydrate? All right, I think we have a tie for the next one, and then everything else is a little bit lower. So I'm going to jump to a fun story about event locations. So I did say that I wasn't going to talk a lot about theory and vocabulary and language, and I did lie about that. So I want to make the distinction between transphobia, which I think a lot of people are familiar with as a fear or hatred of trans people, and transnegativity, because I think I talked before about how a lot of behaviors that negatively impact trans people are not out of malice or active hatred or disbelief of that trans identities exist or anything like that. That doesn't absolve them. So transnegativity is, to me, that means that something has a negative impact on trans people regardless of the intent. It may simply be ignorance. I am certainly guilty of transnegative behaviors when, say, I forget someone's pronouns or misgender them, or make assumptions about presentation. Like, this is a thing that it's incredibly pervasive in our society. And so the point to me of making the distinction between transphobia and transnegativity is that you can perpetuate transnegative environments and actions and do such behaviors yourself without being transphobic. It's not about your personal views on trans people, it's that these things are so ingrained in society that you have to actively work against them. And if you're not, you're perpetuating them. So the reason I'm making that distinction is that this particular story, let's see. This was, so in my previous job, there were a whole bunch of state working groups and organizations and such that you could participate in as a librarian, which was wonderful. And one of the ones that I wanted to get involved in, the first annual meeting that they had when I was living in that state, was that they had scheduled that meeting at a school, at a university that was known for how horrible it was to queer and trans people. Like, I am not exaggerating. This was a school that if they had accidentally hired me, they would have fired me as soon as I came out to them. They were like, I'm not going to get too into it, but I cannot articulate enough how unsafe and uncomfortable this particular school was for queer people. And this was not a secret. They didn't make it a secret. It was not something they were ashamed of. So the fact that this statewide working group had chosen to have their annual event, which was the main way to get involved and to network at this school, meant that I chose not to go to it. When I mentioned to a couple people that I knew, like, I never been involved with this group before, so I was not in a position, I felt, to make a big deal out of it. But I mentioned to a couple friends in the profession that I was not going, and these were the reasons why. And I accidentally started a tiny boycott, which was fairly validating, in that a couple other people, not trans people, mostly, decided to also not attend this event, which otherwise they would have gone to. It still happened. It still went to that school, because at that point, I think they would have said it was too late to change. Something I want to be clear about was that this was a situation, and this is why I'm making the distinction between transphobia and transnegativity. This wasn't a situation that had been chosen for any reason other than the way this working group chose its event locations was the previous year the school had volunteered to host it, and that was just how things happened. A different school volunteered the next year, and we went there. So it both wasn't intentional, but also there wasn't anything in place for people to say beforehand, we're not going to go to this place for these reasons. There just wasn't any kind of system that let you counter the volunteer process. And I think this is also a thing that demonstrates how let's see, things can be, we need these systems and policies to be set up before something happens, because by the time it does happen, it's already harmed people, and also at that point you're telling people that they're not welcome by the fact that it's occurring. So let's see, what ended up happening with that, I mean, nothing really happened with that event. It went, I didn't go. But I think the impact of that is sort of twofold. It meant that I had questions about how welcome I was in that space, in the group, not just the location, because it was weird to me that somewhere that was that overtly transphobic, that hadn't been a deal breaker. And it's not like that information was unknown. And it also just meant from the other side, this wasn't a huge group. They needed members. So all this means that when something is in when something ends up being transnegative for whatever reason, a lot of times people aren't going to fight it or change it. We're just not going to go. And we talk a lot about, I think people are familiar with the concept of the invisible patron, like the people who don't come into libraries and we don't know why because they never get as far as coming in. I think this works for employees as well. So it can happen, say, if you have a diversity committee where someone on it is really horrible to non-binary people and no one calls them out on it or no one notices. That means that if non-binary people consider joining this committee, they're going to probably choose not to because it's not a safe space for them. So this is why it is so important to do this work before someone calls you out on it, before you know that you have a trans person working there or a trans person trying to attend this event. Because by the time someone objects to it, it has already cost the group and potential members. That's all, the harm has already been done. Let's see. Any questions in the chat before we move on to, let's see, I think Research Help is the next one. And I'm going to go quickly through this one because I do want to leave time for broader questions. So this one is another, story from my previous workplace. And so I come out in all my job interviews, partly because it's research on trans inclusion is a big part of my work, and obviously you don't have to be trans to do that, but my identity is a big part of why I do it. So I come out in all my job interviews, and the main reason I do that is to make sure that I am not accidentally ending up somewhere where I won't feel safe or welcome. And this was no exception. I came out in the interview. They were all very excited about the work that I was doing and gave every indication that that would be welcome there. And with this one exception, it was. And I will come back to that for the reason that I'm telling this story. After I had started, during my, I think my first month there, I put up my safe zone sign on the door. If people have done safe zone training, you're familiar with that. It's just a little laminated placard sort of thing that says, it's got probably a rainbow on it. It says that you've done safe zone training and that this is a safe space for LGBTQ+ people. And after I had done this, one of my coworkers, our only reference librarian, came into my office and closed the door and explained to me that she thought that the fact that I had it up might make, I honestly don't remember exactly what she said about this question. What she meant was that she thought transphobic students might feel uncomfortable talking to me. And that was what she prioritized. She specifically used the language of neutrality, and that is something I'm not going to get deeply into, but I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the debates that ALA has had, and like all sorts of the conversations about library neutrality. And I'm just putting that out there that in this case, and this influences a lot of how I view the conversations about neutrality, that language has been used as a weapon, and as a weapon against marginalized people in the profession. And I think it very often does end up being that way. So in the name of neutrality, she thought that having the safe zone sign up was a threat and made the space unwelcoming, which was a fascinating perspective to me, given that it is specifically meant to make the space welcoming to people who don't feel welcome there. So there are a bunch of elements to that, and one of them is the complete lack of awareness that libraries are not welcoming to a lot of people just as a general practice, that we do have to do the work to change that. That work looks like moving away from neutrality to some people, I guess, which is interesting. Specifically in this conversation, this person used language that she didn't know was wrong, that it would have taken very little research to know was wrong. There's a language that we use to talk about trans people has changed drastically over time. And there are terms that used to be considered current, which are now, like, I would be offended if someone called me a transsexual, which this person did. And so this is the part of the conversation I remember because it sticks in my brain. Transsexual, transvestite, whatever, preceded by the acknowledgement that she didn't know the right term. After that acknowledgement, you stop and you ask what the right term is. So this conversation told me a whole bunch of things about not necessarily the space that I was in, but about this person specifically. One of the short-term impacts of it, well, long-term impact, she retired within a couple months or I would have left that job pretty quickly. But the short-term impacts of it, this was our only research and instruction person. This meant that because of this conversation, I was very uncomfortable sending students to get help from her. Partly because, like, I was absolutely certain that this person would misgender any trans students who tried to talk to her. And again, not necessarily intentionally, but just because of some limitations in her worldview. But also because of the language that she had used, regardless of the identity of someone who talked to her, I was fairly certain that she wasn't going to, like, if someone went and asked her for help researching any kind of LGBTQ+ topics, she wasn't going to know how to help them, and she was going to give them harmful information and language. So this impacted both, like, this, I think from her side, well-meaning conversation, but because she hadn't done the work to learn anything, that meant both that I was uncomfortable being around her as a coworker, but also that I didn't want to send students to her for help doing what was her job and what was only her job. It also meant that, like, after she retired and we got a new person, like, I ended up going to the new person and doing a research consultation of my own, looking for information about trans issues in LIS. I would never have had that conversation with the previous person for, again, the same reasons as with the students. One, she wouldn't have been able to help me, and two, I wouldn't have felt comfortable talking about those issues with her. So it's, again, it's not just a student thing. But the really big thing that, so when I was taking notes on how to talk about this experience, I was realizing that I was having trouble stepping back enough to come up with any sort of generalizable takeaways because of the impact that it had had on, and how uncomfortable it had made me feel in that workplace. Not that workplace, I did legitimately love that workplace, but around this particular person. And something that struck me just this morning as I was thinking about this talk was that I'd kind of forgotten how supportive everyone, including this librarian, had been in my interview when I talked about the work I was doing and came out and talked about how this was part of my approach to library work. And that really made me think about how we love the idea of diversity and having a diverse staff and student body, but in a lot of cases, again, like I talked about with the pronouns, and like the practice of pronoun sharing is pretty useless if people then don't do the work to make the changes that they need to do to actually use the correct pronouns. This librarian loved the idea of having someone who was doing research on trans issues in the library and diversifying the library staff. And to my knowledge, I was the only openly trans person on the faculty or staff at that school. It was a small school, but not that small. And so it was really striking to me in retrospect that someone who was so aware of the work that I was doing had not then connected that with the fact that I was actually going to demonstrate that work, and that I was going to behave and exist in ways that were different from the ways that she did. And she felt comfortable coming to me and telling me that I shouldn't be doing that. And this wasn't like going around putting safe zone signs everywhere, because you shouldn't do that. This was what I had put on my office door. And so that's something that and this is something that I am definitely guilty of. I think everyone is in different ways. But I encourage people to do some self-reflection on if something makes you uncomfortable, try to take a step back and think about whether it makes you uncomfortable because it is new and strange, and what that means, like why it makes you uncomfortable, and if that's work that you need to do. Let's see, I'm running up on time. A couple quick wrap-ups before I get into the questions. But like I said before, a lot of these stories are about individual actions, and for better or for worse, individual actions make enormous differences. So almost all of these had nothing to do with library practices or policy, whether profession-wide or the individual workplace. But these actions often have a lot more impact than any kind of policies that exist. And some of them are very good, and some of them are incredibly bad. Let's see. Individual actions are important, but standardized practices and trainings are necessary, partly to counter the negative individual actions and also to support the positive ones. And then my biggest general advice when I talk about all of this is, again, I hate how low a bar it is, but just imagine that someone who is not like you will be doing the thing, doing whatever process, using the restrooms, going through the application, whatever. And you don't need to ask a particular person to find that out. I put a link in the chat to the US Transgender Survey from 2015, which does a good job of demonstrating a lot of the issues that trans people face. These are not library specific, but they're a good start if you don't know where to begin with thinking about things that would impact trans people. So do the work, and it is a lot of work, but it's both very difficult and very simple. Just go through every process that you have and imagine that a trans person will use it, or even if you are transgender, like imagine that someone whose identity differs from yours will use it. Maybe a non-binary person, or someone who hasn't changed their name, or someone who isn't out at work, or all different things. Just imagine that someone else, someone who is not like you, is going to have to go through your process, and think about how to make that safe and comfortable for them. I think we can move on to questions if we have more time. And can I go straight up to 10, or your 10, my 11?
Yeah, we can go right up to 10.
All right.
No, there was a question in the box, in the chat box here, and I'm not sure if you saw it, Stephen, but do you have any tips on calling out such toxic behavior when the person doing such behavior is so clearly defensive, unwilling to learn?
That's some variation on that is the #1 question I get every time I do presentations on this topic. I don't know if it's second or if it's tied with how do we convince administration to care about this, which I really don't have an answer to. But yeah, like it's a really common question of, I care about this and I understand what we need to do, but X coworker doesn't. One thing that I think you can do, and this goes back to doing the work and doing the research, if you can demonstrate to them that there are established practices, or I think one of the links that got put in the chat and will be shared later is there's a Zotero collection that I have been maintaining that anyone can also join and add content to, that is all the information, all the publications that I've found that are positive and helpful on trans issues in libraries. There's not that many of them, and a lot of them are fairly short, and so there's also a very limited amount of research on this topic. But sometimes it helps to demonstrate that this isn't you asking them, this is you pointing out this is best practice, like Library Journal tells you to do this thing. It lends, especially in a workplace where I think often those of us who think about this stuff we're known to yell about it all the time. Like, we're the ones who are on the diversity committees, where people are used to hearing about it from us, and that can make it carry less weight. This is one reason why I am never going to do a gender inclusion workshop for my library or anywhere I work. I'm happy to go other places and do it, but if my library chooses to find funding for it, I will ask them to hire someone else, because hearing it from someone else with the endorsement of either a publication or who's been paid to come in and talk about it can make people listen in ways that they would not otherwise. And that is, I think it's probably a bit of a cop-out answer, but I think this is also something where you have to know your workplace. It's a completely different conversation if it's something that's personally impacted you, or if it's something that they have noticed, or if it's someone you're somewhat friends with and you think they're just acting out of ignorance rather than actual transphobia. Like, there are all sorts of different factors that impact how you can get through to someone. But I think in general, again, this is why things like standardized trainings and setting up policies and best practices can be really helpful, because they mean that individual people aren't the ones having to do the work. Any other questions? Yeah, there's some good conversations in the chat.
If you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can type in the chat, whatever you prefer. And then, Stephen, for those of us who might think of questions later as we're thinking of everything that we heard this morning, we could reach out to you, correct?
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you mean pronouns for, the question in the chat is if there are tips for professional ways to correct incorrect use of pronouns. Do you mean when someone is incorrectly gendering you, or when they're incorrectly using pronouns for someone else? This one's a lot harder when it's you, because it feels a lot more uncomfortable, at least to me, to make something about yourself, even when it's completely valid to do so. There's obviously things like put pronouns in your email signature or your Zoom name. If you're comfortable sharing them in group meetings, you can do that. But let's see. Yeah, the person has pointed out that they do not like attention. I am also a middle child. So this is something where I'm not going to answer your question because I want to put the work onto everyone else, because it shouldn't be, this goes back to before, like, and I fully acknowledge that this is not actually helping you. But I think this is an example of why it's so important for everyone else to do the work, because it feels so uncomfortable sometimes to have to repeatedly ask someone to use the correct pronouns, and to try and make this work about yourself in ways that feels kind of weird to me sometimes. So I would take this question as a prompt for everyone else to seriously really try to do the work, and also to call other people out when, so if you hear someone being misgendered in your workplace, depending on the situation, sometimes it's appropriate for you to do the correcting, like my friend did in the class situation that I mentioned. And this is an example of why that's so important, because it is so exhausting and sometimes unsafe for the person who is actually being impacted to have to do that work for themselves. And believe me, we are so tired of it. Like, maybe you hear it once in a meeting, we hear it every single day, all the time. So if you can, if you know the appropriate way to do it, and if you don't, talk individually to your coworker and ask what they would be comfortable with. I put a link in the chat to a set of flowcharts that I made because I was feeling very cranky about exactly this issue. And it tells you what you can do in a situation where you hear someone being misgendered, or if you misgender someone yourself. And yeah, like someone put in the chat, like, it's so pervasive in our society. My very favorite gendering that happened in a store was a Home Depot employee doing what they were trained to do, and realizing partway through their standard greeting that they didn't know what to call me. And so they settled on, and I quote, sir, ma'am, whatever, which I think is beautiful, because it was, to be fair, a pretty accurate description of my gender at the time. But it also, this happens all the time, like that casual misgendering, it's incredibly destructive with the amount that it adds up. And in a workplace, it tells you, we all have the right to feel safe and comfortable in our workplaces. And this is something that destroys that really quickly. So we're at time, but I think if I can ask all of you one thing, it's just, please do the work. I know it's a lot of work. There may not be support. It's a lot easier if you can team up with other people to do it, but please, please do the work.